kids and reading Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. You don't have such an inner dialogue that like I'm seeing in boys fiction now where the person's, but what I also love is that valor-oriented angle where we've got boys in the boys books that I've edited thus far, like Raleigh and the Pirates, you've got a character who's in these, honest to goodness, incredibly dangerous situations. He's been attacked by a pirate. He's wormed out of their grasp and making his way through the ship to try and save the whole crew. But he's deliberating about a lot of I think he's having moral dilemmas where he's figuring he could make himself safe, but he also understands that if he only is worried about his own skin, everyone else will die, and ultimately he will too, because he can't run a ship by himself. And I think that those are not dilemmas I remember reading in older fiction like Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. And I think that a lot of times the real conflict is an inner one, and I think that they're coming. You've got these characters who are coming around to a really firm and sound moral standing or footing. I hope I'm verbalizing this well, very Isaac, but I think that it's a complex game to write a story for a modern kid because they think more of their feelings now, I think, than at any other time. And this is another reason why we need such the books that Janet was describing that give boys an opportunity to be heroic and make these strong choices that benefit more than just themselves, but that are to the ultimate good. Because that's kind of what life is. We go through our banal days and everything's kind of mundane. We have our usual, belly aches and problems and everything, but we base our responses on our just a deeper well of moral footing. So I think that it is more complex to write for kids than it used to be, because I think kids are more complex there. Or 40 other ways I could say the same thing.
Anybody else?
I keep everything I write pretty PG. There are people that will put a book down if you have damn in it, it's so I try to keep the audience as wide as possible, but I go pretty brutal on violence, although I reference it obliquely. You don't address it in graphic terms, because I don't know, especially some of these historical novels that we've been publishing recently. It's very recently in our history that we might not survive until past your youth. You might not make it to 20. Having immediate family members die, that was just a matter of, that just happened all the time in every family. Every one of you could get out your family Bible or your lineage, and as early as or as recently as two generations ago, it's very common to lose a baby in childbirth, to maybe also lose the mom with the baby. It was god awful before modern medicine, and that's right. The Chicken Little in me thinks we're not that far from that possibly happening again, depending on what goes wrong. So I feel like it has utility to present that things can get harsh, and in a lot of the world it still is that way, very harsh, and life can be a lot more fleeting. But you don't need to. Yeah, it's the difference between. I don't mind using movie ratings. It's the difference between PG and R, showing something. With spice levels, with sex, they call it either fade to black or you show it. It's with violence, it's the same thing. You can reference it in indirect ways, so that it's not. If we were watching it on screen, there's not blood and gore, but you know what's going on. So that's how I like to approach it.
And that kind of brings up something real quick. I want to ask Jake, since you're here too, just sort of add in on this, because we're primarily writing and publishing for an audience that's pretty affluent and that has grown up, with the benefits mostly of modern medicine. And, overall, sometimes we lose perspective on this, but we're pretty safe and pretty sheltered in a lot of ways. Reconnecting them to a time or a place, even if it's fictional, completely fictional and fantastical, where that's not the case. How do you address that? I think that might have been a particular challenge for you, Jake, with setting a story in 1900, where that was still, just like Nick described here.
Yeah, I think, it's certainly a balance. You have to be able to simultaneously, boxers, he was in siege picketing, right? Like this is an active conflict. People are dying. There are some things that I omitted from that. I sort of hinted around. Like that particular conflict. I think John Koenig brought it up in his review of that book. There were thousands of Chinese Christians who were just straight up murdered during that conflict, in retribution for the sin of converting. And some of these things you just have to leave off. It started to tie back into the initial discussion that was had on this. You can't talk down to this audience, but it is a different audience at the end of the day, and so you're kind of threading the needle and figuring out how can I get the point across while also not insulting the people that are reading it. With that, the next one I'm working on has a family where the mother and infant son are gone because of childbirth related complications. So this is certainly stuff that you can add, and it's not stuff that you should shy away from adding. But you do have to be careful with how you navigate it. Even with just the raw violence, violence is part of life. It's going to happen, especially if you're in an exciting period of history. There's a good chance that bad things are happening to people in close proximity to you. That makes it more exciting, but that also makes it more difficult to write that for that particular audience. So it is certainly a balancing act. I know that's not really giving you an answer, but it's just something you sort of have to assess on a situation by situation circumstance. You can have people getting shot, you can have people dying, you can have people getting wounded. It's just, again, you're cranking up or down the level of vivid description that you're putting in there. If I'm writing a novel for adults, I've got a fantasy draft that I put together. That is a totally different ball game than writing something that I'm trying to get into a public school library. And so, it's just, again, it's hard to get a straight answer, but situation by situation, you're just going to have to consider what you're doing. Don't shy away from it, but just certainly acknowledge that, maybe write it, sit on it for a little bit, and go back to it and reread it a little more objectively, after it's cooled down for a few days and think, okay, is this too much? Is this fine? What are these same kids going to be seeing on television? Is it really that much worse or better? It's probably better than not actually seeing it, right? So you can get away with a lot, but you just have to assess what you're doing and how you're doing it when you're getting away with it.
We had I teach public school in Gwinnett County, just outside Atlanta, and around October, made the local news. The mother of one of my kids was killed, murdered. She was part of the scene. I don't remember if she discovered it or not, but she was part of the scene. And the principal called us together, told us what had happened, counselors were available, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it quickly raced through the whole school. And later on that same year, March, this happened in October, in March, the other kid, one of the other mean kids, this 6th grade, started giving her heck about it. This is a relatively affluent area of Atlanta. These kids are closer to the razor than we like to acknowledge or realize. We like to think, oh, it's a normal high school, but I remember growing up, one of my close friends committed suicide because he had an epileptic seizure one day before he could have gotten his driver's license. He fell into epilepsy, deep depression, and committed suicide. and the entire school was gathered together at a auditorium, at a meeting to tell us about it. We can't let ourselves forget how close they come that we don't remember. I agree with dialing it back. I think he made an excellent point on that. And I heard a couple other people say the same thing. I agree. I would never graphically describe it. But at the same time, I'd be very surprised if any of the kids who would potentially read our stuff would truly be shocked by anything we put in there if we approach it the right way.
That's a really good point, I think, because I think what we're all saying up here is we're trying to not raise hothouse flowers, right? And you can't do that by shying away from everything and playing happy fun ball. You know, I don't want to use the throw the word cozy around, but sometimes, you know, reality breaks in.
You know, and I'm probably going to screw up the quote, you know, but it still applies, you know. You don't have to teach kids that monsters exist. You have to teach them that they can be killed. Same thing. You don't have to teach them bad things happen. They know it. We have to teach them that they can be overcame. And to me, that's when, you know, this is why I grew up reading like Louis L'Amour, things like that, where bad things happen, and we did this to fix it.
And I think it's also a difference between something that's meaningful in the story. You know, the example that I gave was Sons of Golden Fire. If it had been a death that was meaningful in the story that changed something fundamentally for Aaron, then yes, it's going to go in there. But, you know, a couple of serial killers on the trail seemed a little too dark and unnecessary. So I think, you know, what it means to the story makes a difference too.
So I want to throw this one out then, you know, not only to the panel, but also to the audience for participation. Just sort of my philosophy on this EIC. I think that the goal of these books, while not beating anybody over the head, message, is to orient them towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. With that said, I also have read a quote that has said things like, there is a difference between being a good man and being good at being a man. What do y'all think about that? Is that a true statement? And if you think it is, what do you think are some things that are different? I'll say one of those things might be, martial valor is a wonderful thing. Martial valor applied to things like burning entire villages down and putting everyone to the sword. I could be a good warrior. I could be a good manly, at the manly art of arms. The good man doesn't do that with that man. Is that the off? That just as an example.
An example from the news that probably everybody here has seen from my hometown, not my hometown, my home state in the last week or so. There was a pastor who was out doing work in the churchyard, and there was a guy across the street yelling some really, really horrible, terrible, nasty things about his family. The pastor goes across the street, the guy takes a swing on him, and the pastor puts him down and, almost
Puts them down hard.
puts him down. Now
God
that's
bless
a,
them.
you know, yeah. That's being good as a man, I think. Being good at being a man, but it's questionable to the length that he went if it's being a good man. I think there's, you know, it's kind of a fuzzy question.
That even gets you into the vigilante stuff about, okay, if they're not going to take care of it, I have to.
Yeah.
Are you being a good man? But when there's nobody there to defend the proper civilized way,
It's really fuzzy.
it is real fuzzy all of a sudden.
Things that swore around some books I don't know.
I think it's a perspective, because from one perspective, say a church-going member of his congregation might be, oh my gosh, I'm horrified my pastor would do that. But I guarantee you his wife would not have been horrified that he stood up and defended the family. You see what I'm saying? I think it all depends upon it, and I think it's the reason we say it's fuzzy is because it's an individual perspective about how we see that event and all the experiences we bring in our lives to that event.
I think sometimes the world forces good men to do hard things. And it's important that being able to make those choices when that line is important. And I think that literature in all of its forms offers children, young men in particular in this case, the opportunity to think about that logically and gate that out. What is your line?
And remember what Kenny Rogers said.
Coward of the county.
Sometimes you gotta fight when you're a man. And I mean, and what I was saying so ill earlier, I mean, I think that one huge component of this is stoicism. Is how do you move in the world? What is the world? What is my place in it? And how do I act to protect the vulnerable around me, or the people I have an option here to do something hard that may risk, maybe even up to my own life, but do I do this to protect those who love me, or who I call family and friends?
I loved what you just said about like almost the more noble use of power, and I think the way to protect from getting like what you were saying, where they have the power and can wipe people out, what stops them from doing that is learning that valor and strength with empathy for others. So we have to teach them how to be powerful, but still see the people around them as human beings.
The biggest mistake I think people make is they confuse good with nice. That's, the preacher, did he do good? Well, you know what, we don't know. What if that guy turns his life around? Because he got the snot beat out of him. Good results, he did good. Was he nice about it? No, he wasn't.
Yeah, I was gonna say, one thing I think you'll find is, that's also a trick deal here is, among your readers, you're gonna have, these fuzzy things where sometimes the reader's gonna agree or disagree with the actions that the character take. Whereas one person might, let's just take the pastor as an example. One reader might say, oh, that was inexcusable overkill. Another might say, oh, okay, his blood was up, but how many times do you have to throw insults and punches before, Afro comes into play?
I think it's really important to show the kid make a wrong decision and what the consequences of it are.
So how do you guys, as editors, what do you look for? As writers, how do you execute that? Let's hear from up here, across the board. Who wants to go first? How do you encourage authors? Is that something that you want to see the authors sort of focus on too? If you notice that might be missing in what you say, but perhaps could be drawn out in a stronger way. How do you make a judgment call on just how much to do that, and how much does it affect the plot?
Aaron makes a lot of wrong decisions. They all work out for him, but he makes a lot of wrong decisions. There are a lot of points in both books where he could have done something much better, approach things in a much better way. Of course, the first wrong decision he makes is wrong in a way, but in the end, that turns out to be a right decision too. So,
Is Pearson here? Hey, yeah, so Jake and Pierce back there. I really like Shy, the main character in one of his series. She is, what is she, 15?
15,
yeah. She fails quite a bit and believably, but she is also surrounded by mentors and family and friends who they are there to not necessarily rescue her from the consequences of her decisions, but they're there to teach her and offer guidance and redirection. I really like how you did that.
Anybody else? Thoughts on this? All right, so we've got a few minutes left. We'll just open it up to comments and questions from the audience, and then wind this one down.
May I respectfully disagree with something that Meg said earlier? We have no problems with using the movie designation as well.
It's my short answer.
I would disagree to this extent. I'm writing a informed younger audience. I allow the violence or the threat of violence or there's something big and bad about it to come down the pipe to flourish more. But I don't allow any of the kids to cuss or what have you, because if you're writing it well, your reader is going to have plenty of prep time to deal with the violence. I mean, if he's, if little Johnny Cremane goes to war, there's going to be war. But by its nature, F-bombs and all of their bastard children come out of the blue. They just, here it is, and I think for one thing, I had just horrible fights with one of my fellow writing partners that cussing does not make your story more sophisticated. He disagreed. But he started to come around to my way of thinking when his prospective in-laws showed up to meet him for the first time at a meeting, and he had the most
All right, I was wondering where you're kind of going.
vulgarity-laden.
Now I get it.
I would never.
Now I see what you mean. All
I
right.
did speak with arse in the first one and Ellen in the second.
Yeah.
But I would never curse in the children. In adult book is a different situation, but even still, I had a journalism professor that made a big impact on me when I was in college, because I had to write a short story for him, a creative story, not a journalistic story, where I needed to use the F word. And it was the word I needed to use. I was so worried about it. And when I went in to talk to him, he said, it's a wonderful word, it's a powerful word. He said, but only use it when it's needed. If you use it when it's not needed, it loses that power. And so that's kind of how, when I'm writing for adults, that's kind of how I approach using profanity in the book.
My suggestion would be that if you're going to adopt a rating system, break it into language and values and stuff is set.
Yeah, something real. Okay.
Question for the whole panel.
Okay.
Why do you think we've seen like the disappearance of heroes in mainstream publishing and even in Hollywood and all that with their tales? We've just seen this major reduction in heroism.
I think it's because we're on there's been the canonization of the victim in our society. And I think it's anathema to a healthy, thriving culture, frankly. I think and I think that being anti-fragile is important, and we all have our vulnerabilities. We all have our crosses to bear, and the truth is, tragedy will come to every one of us if it hasn't already. This is life, but I think that it's difficult to keep our footing. If I keep using that word, I'm sorry, but if we're not recognizing, we gotta suck it up, buttercup, at some point. And I think that
I think there's a degree of moral relativity there, and a degree of the rise of the anti-hero. If there's no truth and there's no virtue, then anything goes. And I think we've got to the point where we've lost the idea that there is good and evil, there is good and bad. Now everything is shades of gray, and I think to be a hero, we go back to comic book Superman, right? Comic book Superman was good. We have Batman, who is a little more on the gray edge of the spectrum. I think we're losing that concept of heroism because we've lost the idea that there is truth and there is good and there is evil.
I think there's sort of an edgelord mentality amongst some creators too, from the praise that people like George Martin got for doing this really dark and depraved stuff. It's kind of, how far can I push it? See how far I can push it.
On the bright side, I'll never say.
I kind of think of it the way I think of it when I'm like for my two sons. Not all attention is good attention. And we're in an era where being the worst is getting the attention, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, but it's still attention.
Reality TV.
Yeah.
I think a large part of it, frankly, as a historian, is that the 20th century was the most violent and destructive century in recorded human history, and possibly in all of, civilized human history, to the extent that we're still recovering, if you want to call it that, from what it did to us. Just in terms of the massive scale of death destruction that seemed to undermine an entire civilization, the whole history of what we considered good, what we considered reliable, what we considered true. And I don't think we finished reckoning with it yet. And I think that's a large part of it. And I kind of consider it one big long war with just a 20-year ceasefire in between. I mean, if you want to think of it this way, I freak people out when I tell them this as an instructor. I say, you want to know what living in a post-apocalypse looks like? Congratulations, you're already living in one. From August of 1945 to the present day. Congratulations. You know what a post-apocalypse looks like. You're living it.
Well, Janet stole my answer. A hero does, many heroes, they do what they do because they have taken a black and white, a hard moral stance. This thing is right, this thing is wrong. And we live in a time and a culture where we can't say that because it otherizes and it excludes. There is no truth, there is your truth and there is my truth. And so that's why.
I think the most radical thing you can do is say, actually, yeah, there is. That's probably the most radical and most subversive thing you could actually do today is actually take a stance. In an era when nobody wants, says that, everything is, yes, there is room for nuance. We temper justice with mercy. Justice without mercy is cruelty. Mercy without justice is license. Right? If you want to think of it that way. So, and and this comes back around full circle again with Paul Nagel. Passing that on to young boys in particular. Because what there is when you do this, set a table. And it's make it so throw it at us, and we'll see what happens next. Anybody else?
This kind of goes back to the very first question. Do you think the difference between writing for girls and boys is girls want to see someone like them? Like every little girl has their princess. For me it was Belle. Finally I found someone who's, she's just like me. Where boys want a hero to aspire to, so that they can grow into. So it's like, the difference between like aspiring to be and identifying with.
Kind of realizing the power you already have versus the taking of that power. I personally, and I think it's more now, some psychological stuff regarding different play styles between boys and girls. I think that's where you're going with this. Basically, and I've even seen this in my own kids, right? My daughter can take Batman and put Batman in her dollhouse, and he's just having tea, right? Versus my son, all of a sudden, he's not there yet, but my nephew, I am Spider-Man. Not, I want to be Spider-Man, I want to be like Spider-Man. No, I am Spider-Man. I think it fundamentally comes down to, and I think it's actually good for girls to realize that, you are in a lot of ways already who you're going to be. And it's learning to love that and live in that. For boys, it's much more of a piece of play with a lot of potential. And it's just a different mindset, a different outlook on life, and it's a different approach to it. That's just my standpoint. I bring that in really as, a father of two wildly different kids that are similar in many ways and so radically different in so many others, and trying to be the best father I can with both of them. According to what their needs are. Maybe you stay on this number. Anything else want to chime in about? Cool. Hey, everybody, thanks.